Hello, everybody, and welcome to EcoWatch TV. My name is Leah Segedie. I'm the host of Mamavation, and this is Pete Myers of Environmental Health Sciences. We have a great show for you today. We've been asked by EcoWatch to talk about something incredibly important that's happening. We're going to be discussing a lot of things about safety. What is safe? How is that determined by the feds? How is that determined by independent scientists and pediatricians? How safe is determined, how it's protecting or not protecting your family, green products that are out there and why they're out there, and what you can do about this. So there's a lot of conversations to have right now because we're in an interesting position right now with a new administration coming up that's very, I would say, anti-environmental. We've lost over 1,600 people at the EPA. The FDA right now is being a little problematic, and we'll go into some details about that. But I wanted to introduce to you Pete Myers. He's the founder of Environmental Health Sciences, also known as Environmental Health News. He's been nationally recognized by the National Institutes of Health and also by the Endocrine Society and several other societies. He also coined the phrase endocrine disrupting chemical. So if you've heard that phrase, this is the man that coined that phrase. He's been working on this science for about 30 years now. And we're very, very honored to have him here at EcoWatch. And I just wanted to say thank you, Pete. And could you just introduce yourself to the audience and a little bit about what you've been doing?
Sure. Hi, Leah. Great to be here with you. Always a pleasure. And I look forward to interacting with our listeners out there. So I'm a biologist by training. I got a PhD at Berkeley. And I wound up working with Theo Colborn, who really is the founder of the field of endocrine disruption. In about 1988 is when I started working with Theo. We wound up writing a book in 1996 called Our Stolen Future. It was translated into 16 languages. It was a bestseller. Then Vice President Al Gore wrote the foreword. And I even got to have tea with the Emperor of Japan about that book. It was pretty cool.
That's amazing.
Yeah. So beginning in 2002, I founded Environmental Health Sciences. And in 2003, we started publishing Environmental Health News, which is a free aggregation of news about the environment and health from mainstream media sources all around the world in English. And we haven't missed a day since August 3rd, 2003. So if you want some news that's free, but really important, subscribe to Environmental Health News, ehn.org. We do a lot of other stuff. I just published a paper along with Fred Vom Saal, who's the world's leading authority on the health effects of bisphenol A, BPA. The paper was published in the Journal of the Endocrine Society, and it shows that at really low doses that the FDA considers safe, it starts some physiological processes in people that, if they were to continue, could possibly lead to type 2 diabetes. It's a really important exploratory study that opens a potential new pathway into understanding why type 2 diabetes has become such an epidemic, and in providing suggestions for how you can protect yourself from type 2 diabetes. So that's some background.
I don't know if you guys caught that, but he just said that this is the first human trial. And this comes about because, you know, the chemical companies and the industry who's profiting from these chemicals that they're putting into our consumer products are saying that animals are not humans. So if you test an animal, that doesn't mean it's going to be harmful to humans. And so this is essentially a response to that by saying, now we've tested humans. Do you have any, maybe some more words about that, Pete?
Yeah, there are good reasons why it was the first peer-reviewed study to work directly with humans. It's very difficult to construct an experiment with humans and a toxic substance that's ethically done. We worked hard with the University of Missouri, specifically with their institutional review board, to do this study in a way that it satisfied their ethical concerns about the experiment. And here are a couple of key points. First, none of the subjects could have been pregnant. The women were all postmenopausal, and the guys don't get pregnant, at least not under current laws of nature. So that's one thing. Second, and very important, we're all exposed to BPA every day. The sources are multiple. Probably the single most important source is handling receipt paper, a specific type of receipt paper that is very common, abundant, and contains BPA dust on the surface. And what we did prior to dosing the people, one very low dose, was to instruct them for 2 days how they could reduce their own exposures. So when they came into the experiment, their BPA levels were really low. And the dose that we gave them brought them back up to where they had been. So in essence, over that 3-day period, they had less BPA than they would have normally because we were all exposed. And what the key thing, that then gave us a way to very precisely know exactly how much they had gotten. And the precision of that measurement then made it more possible to find patterns in the data in our measurements.
Yeah, and you found a precursor to type 2 diabetes.
Yeah, we found that the dose affected insulin secretion. You need insulin to deal with blood sugar. It helps move the glucose, the sugar from that's in your blood because it's something you've eaten. It moves those into muscle tissues and other tissues. That's what insulin does. And when insulin stops doing that, you get type 2 diabetes. So what we saw was the very first precursor step. It altered insulin secretion, and it did so at a level that FDA's calculation of what is safe and what is not, if they were right, our results were impossible.
Right. And yet they were there, which leads us to our main discussion about how is safe determined by the feds, and what are some of the issues that independent scientists like Pete Myers has with how they determine safe. Now, on Mamavation.com last week, we posted a whole post about what is safe, how is it determined, and what are the issues behind what's happening right now. And there were 3 points that we made. And I wrote this piece, but I had Pete was basically the person making the points, and I interviewed him and John Warner about, all the things that are happening right now. And Pete has so much experience here because he's been dealing with this for 30 years. Ladies and gentlemen, 30 years is a long time to know as much as he does and see as much as he has in the politics behind what's happening. And one of the things that is very important for you to understand is that idea of high dose testing versus low dose testing. Now I'm going to describe what this is really quick, but then I'm going to let Pete describe it even more in detail for you. So what's essentially happening is the FDA is really concerned about high dose testing. They get that high dose results, and then they extrapolate what they think would happen at a low dose without actually doing the low dose testing. Now, from the 30 years of endocrine disruption science, it tells us that low doses are very problematic and sometimes worse than high doses. And so if they're only looking at high doses and extrapolating what they think is going to happen, they're missing a whole world of what could happen. Pete, can you further that a little bit more?
Sure. So Leah got it right. And here's why that happens. And it isn't just 30 years, it's about 50 years of science by endocrinologists. This is what you learn if you take endocrinology 101 at a university. You learn that as the lessons start with what hormones do. Hormones are moving through your blood and they're turning genes on and off at the right time. So at one dose, a hormone will turn on or turn off, will change the expression of a specific gene. At another dose, that same hormone can change the expression of a different gene, a completely different gene. And sometimes the way that works is the first dose at the low dose causes a gene to turn on that begins to move some physiological process. And then if the dose then goes up, another gene is expressed that then turns around and turns off that first process. So it's a negative feedback loop. It's like your thermometer, your thermostat, excuse me. It's a negative feedback loop. So the thermometer turns off the furnace when the air temperature gets too warm. Well, some genes turn off other genes when the doses get too high. So forever, at least since the 16th century, toxicologists who are unaware of how hormones work have assumed that the dose makes the poison, that the higher the dose, the bigger the effect, and that they can perform high dose testing and then anticipate how that is going to work at low doses. And that's the way that they derive a safe level. They start at a high dose, they work down the dose response curve, they give lower and lower doses until they don't see an effect. Okay, that level is called the no observed adverse effect level. They then introduce a series of correction factors that take into account the reality that rats aren't little people, and that children aren't little adults, and that there's a lot of variability among people in how we deal with toxicants, genetic variability. So in essence, what they do is they take that no observed adverse effect level, which was the highest, which is the first dose where they didn't see an effect as they're working down the dose response curve, and they divide that by 1,000, and that's called the reference dose in FDA and EPA lingo. So if you divide that dose by 1,000, you get down into a really low dose range. And they have assumed in every single regulatory test that has ever been performed in every country that 1,000-fold, or what sometimes it's a little different than 1,000-fold, but that correction factor will make sure it's safe because it's 1,000-fold beneath something that didn't show any effect. Let me give you an example. So a man named Bruce Blumberg studies how genes involved in controlling your weight are vulnerable to what have become known as obesogens. At 1 part per billion, that's a pretty small amount, 1 part per billion of a synthetic hormone, exposure of a mouse pup to that compound, and that mouse is tracked until it becomes an adult. It's morbidly obese as an adult. Wow. I mean, super fat. If you give it 1,000 times that, so instead of 1 part per billion, you give it 1,000 parts per billion, it's then, what do you think?
Skinny.
It's skinny.
Right.
So low doses cause morbidity, high doses cause weight loss.
Then you look around at what's happening in the United States and you think,
Bruce has
do that.
Bruce has written a really good book called The Obesogen Effect. I highly recommend it if you want to get deeper into this science. Anyway, so that's one example of how if you begin at high doses with this particular chemical, you'd see weight loss. So you'd choose a lower and lower dose until there's no difference between the control animal, the ones that aren't dosed at all, and the experimental animal. So that then tells you where the no observed adverse effect level is. You then divide by 1,000, okay? Well, unfortunately, 1,000-fold beneath the high dose yields morbid, truly morbid obesity. And as I said, here's why this is important. As I said, every regulatory test that's ever been done with chemicals to figure out what level is safe have used that flawed assumption that the dose makes the poison. For endocrine disrupting compounds and for hormones, actually, that's the wrong assumption. And for example, we just did a webinar last week on matters related to this. And Leah, can you send out the link to that webinar in case people are interested?
We'll put the link down below when the shows are
great.
That's you guys.
Great.
Webinar, and we're actually going to talk about this in a couple minutes as well.
Yeah. So what this webinar was about was a collaborative effort between the FDA and academic scientists like Fred Valmsal. Fred was actually involved in the experiment to try and get around this conundrum. Why do the FDA what are called guideline studies find no effects at low doses when they test them, because in this experiment, it was collaborative. They did test a wide range of doses, whereas the academic studies can find effects at low doses. And so the experiment played out, and it got complicated because the regulators at the FDA may not have liked the sort of things that were emerging from the study. But
convenient results is what we're talking about.
Yeah, we didn't. So the FDA published the results of their guideline studies online in February, early this year. We took them, and Laura Vandenberg at University of Massachusetts Amherst did an independent analysis of the results. The FDA, looking at their data, said there are no low dose effects. Laura, looking at their data, found low dose effects, looking at the very same data. Wow. Statistically significant results at low doses. Well, if you look carefully or listen carefully to what the FDA says, and they did a webinar after we did, they say, we found significant effects at low doses, but because there were no effects at high doses, the effects at low doses were meaningless, excuse me.
Wait, what? How is that? That doesn't even make any logical sense.
Well, it's because they are mired in that old, out-of-date idea that the dose makes the poison. And when they saw that there were low dose effects and no high dose effects, they said that can't be real. So even though their own data said that they had significant effects, they threw them out. Now, we actually analyzed, or Laura analyzed, not just their data, but also the data of the independent participants in this. And they were roughly, there were a lot of animals involved in this experiment, and a lot of, literally millions of dollars to run it over a 6-year time period. And when Laura analyzed she pooled the data from FDA and the data from the independent investigators, and said, okay, first of all, how many of the effects, how many things that they measured showed any ability of bisphenol A to affect them? And there were something like 70 odd, and they call them endpoints.
Right.
Endpoints that they measured, in which they found 70 effects. In 70 of them, they found effects. They then said, Laura did analysis. Okay, in some of them, the effects are only seen at high doses, and that was about 20%. In some of them, they were seen at both low and high doses, and that was a little bit more, I think it's 27%. But in 51%, there were only effects seen at low doses. And the FDA said, throw them out. They don't make sense.
So they threw out 51% of the evidence. So to speak.
Roughly 50%. They said it doesn't make biological sense.
It doesn't make sense in our world. Therefore, it's fake news.
Yeah.
We did the study ourselves. We found that there was low dose. There was issues in low doses. It doesn't make sense in our parameter, in our little box. So therefore, it's fake news.
Now,
that's exactly what they've said.
Yeah, and we took Pat Hunt, who's another speaker in the webinar that we did, sponsored by Carnegie Mellon University. Pat said, okay, so what if the FDA were forced to accept the reality of the low doses that had effects? What would that mean for the safe dose, the reference dose? Well, the reference dose would have to be lowered by a factor of 20,000. 20,000,
which basically means nothing. They couldn't.
Yeah. And frankly, if I had to bet, my reason for believing, if I had to bet why is the FDA so recalcitrant on this issue, is because the implications are so large. Because it's not just bisphenol A. Bisphenol A is a very big chemical. There are millions of tons of it produced every year. But there are other chemicals that also show non-monotonicity. In fact, if it's an endocrine disrupting chemical, according to Dr. Linda Birnbaum, who is the director of the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences, she wrote in an editorial about 6 years ago that what we call non-monotonicity, where low doses are different from high doses. Mm-hmm. She wrote that should be what you expect in hormones and in endocrine disrupting compounds. You also see it in vitamins. You see it in pharmaceuticals. It's common in many areas of science, but the FDA refuses to accept it as a fundamental principle. And so that leads them
really inconvenient truth to them, because essentially what we're saying is, if they accept this as being truth and not call it fake news anymore, or not throw out 51% of the evidence, if they actually accepted this as scientific truth, then it would rock the industry, is essentially what would happen. Yep. And we're not just talking about bisphenols, which you guys know as BPA, but it's also BPS, which is a sister chemical. And I would say she's just as bad, if not worse, as her sister. She's just younger, okay? And all of the other bisphenols, but this is also phthalates. This is also certain pesticides. This is hundreds and hundreds, I would say thousands. What I'm saying, thousands of chemicals? No.
If I had to bet, I would, but so few chemicals that are in use today have been tested for endocrine disrupting effects. We know of several hundred, but there probably are thousands.
Right. So essentially what Pete's saying is, we don't even know what the answer to that question is. We're just chipping away at this one chemical here. We're proving that it does actually harm at teeny tiny itty bitty. And to understand really what this means, the equivalent is a drop in an Olympic-sized pool. It's kind of like what these levels are. And so it's like, okay, less than a drop in an Olympic-sized pool, or do we just get rid of it completely? And so according to Pete and his scientists, these chemicals are not safe, especially not in low doses, not in high doses, not in anywhere. We need to start considering getting rid of a lot of these chemicals. So we know that bisphenols is harmful. Now, there's mountains of evidence that bisphenols are harmful, and yet the FDA kind of says, la, 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 I can't hear you. Now, the irony is a lot of these studies have been produced with money from the federal government, from the National Institutes of Health. How much money would you say, Pete, that they have spent, national money, federal money, our tax dollars, on looking in to see if these chemicals are harmful or not? How much would you say?
Well, the National Institute of Environmental Health Sciences certainly has put over 50 million, if not 100 million, into studies looking at endocrine disrupting compounds in general. I don't know the budget numbers very well. But let me go back to something you said. I noticed someone from EWG is here. You said it's like a one drop in an Olympic-sized swimming pool. Well, EWG said a part per billion is like one pancake in a stack of pancakes 4,000 miles high. Wow. Imagine that, okay? But then here's the other way to look at this. That one drop, let's imagine that one drop has 1 part per billion in it. How many molecules of bisphenol A do you think are in that one drop at 1 part per billion?
Well, that's a question. Thousands? Hundreds? I don't know.
Well, if anyone out there listening is a chemist, they will immediately think of Avogadro's number, which I won't get into, but it's the key here. There would be 2.65 trillion molecules of bisphenol A in that one drop.
Wow.
At 1 part per billion. And it takes one molecule to initiate the changes in gene expression that bisphenol A causes.
Wow.
In one receptor.
It's mind-blowing that they're ignoring all of this. And they're also ignoring our tax dollars spent on researching this. And yet they're throwing all of that away because it's inconvenient. It's very, very inconvenient.
It's highly inconvenient.
Yep. So I think we should move on to our second point. Another thing that's happening that we really, really disagree with is that idea that, for instance, when they test pesticides, they're only testing the active ingredient, not the entire formulation. Now, let me give you an example here. So we've all heard of glyphosate, which is Roundup, right? So Roundup is a weed killer. It was produced by Monsanto, yada, yada, yada. Glyphosate is the active ingredient. In order to get glyphosate passed They only tested glyphosate. They didn't test the formulation. So it would be like if I wanted to test the spaghetti sauce in my kitchen, it would be the equivalent of me taking those tomatoes and only testing the tomatoes, but avoiding testing the oils and the herbs and anything else I put in there as a whole formulation. That's essentially what they're doing. Can you describe a little bit more in detail how that's happening, Pete?
Well, the important point, and you made it, the general picture you made that very well. I love the spaghetti analogy. The thing about it is that those other ingredients are put in there to increase the effectiveness of glyphosate. Mm. So by definition, you are underestimating the consequences of exposure to Roundup because it's glyphosate plus a bunch of stuff that makes that more powerful. It makes it stick to the plant longer. It makes it penetrate the cell easier. A whole series. It changes the characteristics of the active ingredients impacts.
It pulls it into the skin, so to speak.
It does, yeah. It does a bunch of different things.
So here's another example that I'm gonna give you, and it's outside of pesticides. But when we're talking about thermal receipt paper, so of course you heard what Pete said, that one of your largest exposures to bisphenols is thermal receipt paper. So when you're handling those receipts. Now, there's one thing that you can do to make that exposure 10,000 times worse. I'm sure that's not really a number, but way worse. And that's putting that antibacterial gel on your hands because it has alcohol, and alcohol acts as an adjunct. It pulls things into your skin more. So that's an idea. So think about that idea where if you're putting this alcohol-based gel on your hands and then you're touching a bisphenol, the point of having that alcohol in that product is to make it sink in quicker. And that's very similar to what's happening in something like Roundup, right? So Roundup, those adjuncts are there to essentially make the active ingredient more toxic, pulls it into the plant, does those things. So do you want to extrapolate on that, talk about that a little bit, Pete?
I think you did a great job. It was excellent. Some of the weeds that I would talk about, I don't think are worth spending time on. So thank you.
Yeah. Okay, so that's that second point. So first point was, remember, high dose testing will not give you low dose results. You have to do that low dose testing to see what's happening.
But could I offer one comment there? It's really important to bear in mind that other things happen at high doses. So it's not as simple as low doses are more dangerous. Low doses are different. They cannot be predicted from high doses. So you've got to do low dose testing, and you've got to chase it down until you truly don't see an effect, instead of the fake news we're getting from the FDA.
Right. So doses. Okay. Second, we're talking about to only testing active ingredients. What they need to do is test a formulation, the entire thing, which leads us to our third point. Is about the testing and instrumentation that they're using at the FDA and with a lot of these studies that are industry driven. And what the scientists are saying is, hello, it's the 21st century. We have 21st century testing, and they're using testing that's sometimes from the 1930s to determine safety. Now, it's been, the 1930s? How long ago was that? That was the 20th century. We're now in a new century. Shouldn't we be using technology that reflects our modern world? We absolutely should. Pete, can you talk about that?
Sure. Just imagine you were to go to a doctor, an endocrinologist, someone who is treating you for type 2 diabetes or prostate cancer or breast cancer. Typically, you see an endocrinologist when you have problems like that. What if they had a sign on their door that said, "I believe in 16th century science"? Because the basic assumption about dose makes a poison literally comes from the 16th century. There's been a few changes since then in science.
Yeah, a little bit.
And we need to take advantage of the incredible things that modern medicine, particularly once we learned how DNA works, and how genes work, and how gene expression is controlled by hormones, and how endocrine disrupting chemicals interfere with gene expression as it's controlled by hormones. We know so much now. We can really do an amazingly better job than the primitive efforts that the FDA is applying to it. I use an analogy here, borrowing from Leah's technique. Imagine you were looking at National Geographic and you saw pictures of the Hubble Space Telescope, from the Hubble Space Telescope, of those galaxies, and wonderful, wonderful, beautiful pictures. And you look at them and you think, I've never seen that. So you grab your binoculars and you go into the backyard, and therefore you decide the Hubble Space Telescope photographs must be fake news because you can't see it.
Can't see it. Must be fake. Must be fake. But yet there are galaxies inside the human body that they're ignoring because they're using the equivalent of binoculars to look inside. And there's so much out there that they're missing. Would you say that that's true?
Absolutely true. And the other thing about it is the tools they use, they call them assays. The assays they use to test for safety are pretty crude. And they usually are only indirectly at best related to today's diseases. They aren't directly related to type 2 diabetes or prostate cancer or breast cancer or one of many different types of endocrine related problems we and our kids and grandkids are facing. The tools that we now have from 21st century medicine provide assays that actually help us get there, like the way that we worked with the type 2 diabetes experiment that I mentioned earlier. We have better tools available to us today that we're not using, that they're not using, and yet they call the shots in setting what levels are safe.
So as you can see, this is a frustration for independent scientists, and it's been a frustration for them for 50, 30 years. Now, don't forget, everybody, number one, they're not doing the low dose testing. Number two, they're only testing the active ingredient. And number three, the way they're doing the testing is completely out of date. Now, if you, again, what Pete said, if you would not go to a doctor, right, who advertises that he uses 16th century techniques to evaluate your body, that's crazy. But that's essentially what's happening at the FDA. And that's essentially how they're determining safety. Now, I do want to move on to the study that we're talking about. The study that Pete was talking about was called the Clarity Study. And the Clarity Study was a really important study where you basically had the independent scientists working together with industry and the FDA to do a part one and a part two, and something that would finally tell us once and for all if BPA was safe. And it was a collaboration of both sides. But Pete, there's been a little bit of an issue with what's been happening. So what basically has happened is the way the study was supposed to be created, there was a part one of the study that was using these old technologies, these old ways of finding out and determining safe. And then there was supposed to be a part two using more modern techniques and endocrine disrupting principles behind that and methods. But what's happened is the FDA has decided to make a determination after the first part of the study and completely ignore the second part and go dun 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 dun, BPA is safe and you can slather it all over your children. There's nothing to see here. So I'd love for you to talk a little bit about that, Pete, so you can tell everybody the frustration that you guys are having and what we're seeing at the FDA right now. Well,
first of all, the experiment called Clarity BPA, and Clarity is a long government acronym that I can never remember, but it's exactly what Leah described. You've got government scientists collaborating with university scientists, governments doing the guideline studies that they always do, and providing tissues and sometimes animals to the independent scientists so they can look at the endpoints, use the assays, use the tests that they have used that have shown low dose effects of BPA. And then the two were supposed to have been integrated. But unfortunately, beginning even before the formal Clarity program started, FDA, BPA, I get them confused.
Yeah, I do too.
The FDA began releasing results saying that BPA at low doses was safe, which is what they had decided in 2008. In a regulatory decision, which their scientific advisory board said was wrong. So they've got a long track record of digging in to say BPA is safe at low doses. So what did, I had lost my train of thought. What do you want?
So now let's describe what happened. So how?
Oh, okay, sure. Yeah. So Clarity BPA was a great idea. It was a man named Jerry Heindel, who was the program officer at NIEHS in charge of grants on endocrine disruption for about 20 years. He came up with the idea because he was really frustrated because they had all these results coming out from independent laboratories where NIEHS was funding the best science. All that was being ignored. And the FDA was basing its decisions on a very small number of guideline studies conducted by industry. And so Jerry thought, let's do a collaboration. Let's work together to solve this. A few things started to go wrong. Like the head of the Center for Food and Nutrition Safety, CFSAN, at the FDA in a meeting as they were setting this up, meeting with the independent scientists, looked at them and said, "I don't care what you find. We're going to ignore it." Ooh, that was in a meeting of about 20 people. That was
it's right there.
Yeah. Okay. And then the FDA insisted that they use the FDA's rat at the laboratory in Arkansas where the rats were raised and the guideline studies were carried out. They insisted they use that strain of rats, even though that strain of rat had already been found relatively insensitive to estrogen. So BPA's effects, a lot of them, not all, but a lot of them are estrogenic. One of the basic rules of toxicology is to use an animal that's sensitive to the type of effect you're looking for.
That's crazy.
That was crazy.
Rat type. That's so they're setting up the test essentially to say nothing to see here. It's all about what you do, right? Yeah.
They also a standard part of an experiment like this, if you're an endocrinologist, is you have three groups. You have the experimental group. These are the ones that are exposed. You have the control group, the negative control group. They're not exposed. And then you have a positive control group. Now, what is a positive control group? Well, what's that for is you expose the positive control group to a known estrogen. In this case, they use the estrogen that's used in birth control pills, which is known to render 99% of women infertile for that month. Okay, so it's a powerful estrogen. They use that to show that the experiment worked. Because if you don't have, there's more to this. So that's the traditional way an endocrinologist does an experiment: negative control, positive control, and an experimental group. The FDA did not want to have a positive control. They argued vehemently about having a positive. They didn't want it. Of course, if they didn't have one and there weren't any results, we wouldn't know if there were no results because the experiment failed or because bisphenol A didn't have an effect. That's why a positive control is crucial.
Right.
Only with a positive control, you can show the experiment worked, but bisphenol A didn't cause an effect. Okay, so finally, the independent scientists got them to do a positive control. Okay. So that was good. Third, they used a way to deliver the BPA, very common in toxicology, but one that endocrinologists don't use because it's stressful. They would constrain the rat while they were delivering the dose, and they would stick a tube down its stick a tube down its mouth into the stomach.
Right.
And they did that every day of the rat's life.
Wow.
And one pilot experiment that was done in which the independent scientist, this is the lead up to BPA, an independent scientist got some of the FDA's rats, but they had added a different positive control, a negative control. They had actually had one in which the rats weren't constrained. So less stressful and no gavage.
Gavage, that's the word.
That's the word. I'm sorry. I was trying to avoid words like that.
Scientist.
Yeah. So what that study showed is that the rats were stressed, and brain differences that normally exist between female and male rats were dramatically reduced, making it much harder to detect the effect of bisphenol A. So all of these rats were stressed. A tube down their mouth, into their stomachs, every day of their life.
Imagine how you would feel if someone forced something down your throat and put chemicals down your throat. Now you're a rat, you don't even know what's going on. Imagine how you would feel. Your heartbeat would raise, your adrenaline would rush. You would just be very, very scared. Your body would completely change. That's what happens.
There are stress hormones that go to work and alter hormonal reactions of other systems. There was one group of rats that wasn't exposed throughout its life by gavage, but it was gavage for the first, I forget, 20 or 30 days. They were all stressed. So that's another problem. A third problem. So here's this pilot experiment done by FDA and the independent scientists. And the FDA presents its results at the AAA, the American Association, the American Academy, AAAS, the American Association for the Advancement of Science, the big science institution in the country. They had their annual meeting in Boston in, I believe, 2014. I was there. And the FDA presented their side of the preliminary study saying, no effect, BPA is safe. Only later in a published paper did they reveal that the negative controls were contaminated.
What? Contamination?
By BPA.
Validate a study. They didn't invalidate the study.
So that was for the pilot study, okay?
Okay.
They then did the big study. They didn't ever identify the source of the contamination. They then did the big study without changing anything, but crucially, and without measuring for contamination.
Whoa. So you're saying not only did they set it up to kind of be a little sketchy, but then knowing that there was contamination, they didn't look into removing that contamination when they did the actual study?
Yep.
Seems to me like this should be completely thrown away. Doesn't seem like science to me at all.
Despite, I basically agree with you. Despite that, there were some low dose effects. There were not, in some instances, in cases which had produced very strong effects in other studies by the independent scientists, those effects weren't seen here. And the other effects were reduced compared to what they had found before. But it's highly likely that at least some of the controls in the big study were contaminated, but they didn't measure. It's kind of like see no evil, measure no evil.
Right. They're doing this, and they're not reporting.
Yeah.
I understand why you guys are upset. I'm upset. I'm upset for you. And then they went public with this, which is even more upsetting, right?
And they went public hoping to get ahead of us in the media.
And so the second part of the clarity study hasn't even happened yet. Can you talk?
Oh, no, it has. It has
happened. Okay,
and a lot of the results have been published, not all, because some of them take a long time to do the analyses, and it always takes scientists longer than you expect to write things up. So those studies have been, and actually there's an excellent, if you look at the webinar, it has 3 parts. At first, there's Dr. Laura Vandenberg from University of Massachusetts Amherst doing her independent analysis of the FDA's own data. And she finds significant low dose effects. Okay. Second, there's Dr. Gail Prince from the University of Illinois at Chicago, who's a world expert on how BPA contributes to the risk of prostate cancer. She works with rats. And she analyzes the independent scientist data, what's been published. And she finds a lot of low dose effects. Then and she also combines the independent studies and the core studies for their effects. And that's where that number of 51% of the effects are only seen at low doses. Gail does a beautiful job explaining that. Yeah. And then the third presenter is Dr. Pat Hunt, who's a famous geneticist at Washington State University, who was not at all interested in toxicology or anything like that until her mice. She's famous for work on why, as a woman ages, is she more likely to have a baby that has Down syndrome.
Okay.
And she had a mouse experiment, long-term series of experiments exploring different facets of that. And she had controls, so experimental animals and controls. And one day in her lab, the rate of this peculiar chromosomal change, which leads to Down syndrome, the rate of that in the controls went up 20-fold, not 20%, 20-fold.
Wow.
And it took her about, I'd say 6 months to realize that what had happened was that a lab tech had washed out the mommy mice's water bottles with a harsh bleach, and they were polycarbonate, and the bleach leached into mom.
Oh, wow.
And the babies were dosed with BPA. And she then began experimenting with BPA itself and replicated the work.
So these genius things happen by accident, and then
actually, because of Pat's work and Fred Rumsell's work and others' work, laboratory scientists have become much more careful about what types of plastics they let into their labs. Right. If you're a good scientist, there's no more polycarbonate plastic in your lab. So they started using something called polyether sulfone. Mm-hmm. And Pat, just on the 13th of this month, published a paper showing that as polyether sulfone degrades, it leaches a sister of bisphenol A that gets into the mice and causes the same effects. Mm-hmm. And Pat has a genius paper that's just out on that. But anyway, so Pat, in her presentation in the webinar, tries to ask, okay, so what did we learn from Clarity BPA? What did we do right? What did we do wrong? And the general agreement is that the idea behind Clarity BPA is revolutionary and ought to be repeated. But when it's repeated, there shouldn't be participants who have conflicts of interest.
Right, right.
And you have to do simple things like choose an animal model, a rat or a mouse, that's sensitive to the types of effects you're looking for, instead of the FDA's, which was insensitive. And then you have to make sure you've got positive controls for the reasons I described. You have to monitor for contamination, because contamination comes at you from all sorts of different directions that you can't always predict. So there's some good things about it, and there's some about the great things about design, bad things about the execution. But the one slide that I think you'll all remember is where she shows the results of you incorporating the low dose results that were obtained by FDA and the independent investigators. What happens when you incorporate that into a new calculation of what's safe? And as I said earlier, it reduces the safe level by a factor of 20,000.
And that's basically no bisphenols, people. No
That's right.
That's essentially nothing. So recap, because we have some people that have joined in. Thank you, James, for that comment saying that what the heck is going on here. I have Pete Myers with me with Environmental Health Sciences. He's a scientist who's been working on endocrine disruption for 30 plus years. My name is Leah Segedie. I'm with Mamavation, and we're discussing what does safe mean? How do the feds determine safe? And what are the issues behind how they're determining it? Now, I'm going to go over those 3 points. There's 3 points that we've made that is a problem, right, with the way the feds evaluate chemicals that needs to change. Number one, they're only doing high dose testing, and that will not give you results of what happens at low doses. But they're completely ignoring that, and that needs to change. Number two, when they're evaluating things like pesticides, they're only considering the active ingredient instead of the formulation, the whole formulation. So they're taking one active ingredient out, testing that, ignoring how it is and how it's experienced by actual people. That's number two. And then number three, the testing and instrumentation and methods that they're using is completely out of date, coming from 16th century. And a lot of this testing is coming from the 1930s and the 1940s. And today it's the 21st century. We have modern testing and modern understanding of how DNA works. And it's not what we thought in the 16th century. So those are the 3 reasons or 3 things that really need to be changed by the feds in order to really evaluate what safety is. Now, it's leading me to my next discussion of what happened with the American Academy of Pediatrics. The American Academy of Pediatrics came out about a month ago saying, and it reflecting what Pete just said, and they said the way the FDA evaluates food additives, right, is putting pregnant women and children into danger because of a lot of these things that we're saying, in addition to, children are more sensitive to a lot of these things, and they're not considering hormonal impacts of a lot of these chemicals. And because that's happening, they're putting pregnant women and children into danger. Now, specifically, they called out bisphenols, BPA, BPS, the whole category class. They also called out phthalates, which are all even though these are not food additives, these are called indirect food additives, which means there's 3,000 indirect food additives that are approved by the FDA that can find their way in your food, but they don't have to be labeled. That these companies don't have to tell you they're in there. And the problem is, a lot of times these companies don't even know themselves. How do I know that? Because I ask them and they have no idea. And it's a big problem. So a couple of these chemicals, as in bisphenols and phthalates, we know from the mountains of science that have happened in the past 20, 30 years, that these are harmful chemicals. And they're harmful at tiny, itty bitty amounts, which is like the equivalent of a drop in an Olympic-sized pool, or one pancake on the stack of pancakes that's all the way almost to the moon, right? So this is problematic. This is something that needs to change at the FDA. Do you want to talk a little bit about what the American Academy of Pediatrics said? And I know some of your friends were instrumental in getting them to see this too.
Yeah, the lead author for that report was a pediatrician and epidemiologist from New York University named Leo Segedie. And I've worked closely with Leo on a couple of different projects. You got the big picture perfectly. Excuse me.
So as he's looking at
Sorry.
it, he's very important. Man. He's got stuff going on all the time. But you were saying, Pete?
That you got the big picture correctly. The Academy of Pediatrics. These are the doctors that are responsible for taking care of our kids.
These are thousands of pediatricians all over the United States.
They came up with a very strong statement criticizing the approaches that the regulatory agencies are using in their examination of the safety of endocrine disrupting compounds. They said it has to change.
So not only are the independent scientists crying foul, but the pediatricians, thousands of pediatricians across the United States, are crying foul. And the FDA is still standing there saying, BPA is safe and you should slather it all over your children. But we actually have some good news. We have some good news. There are some things that we're doing. So this is good news for some people, but not good news for other people. There's an industry that is springing up, with these green living products, organic food, non-toxic cleaning products, non-toxic personal care products. There's a whole industry that is springing up, and it's kind of like an understanding that no, we don't trust what the FDA is doing. No, we kind of disagree with how the feds are evaluating these chemicals. And you know what? We're going to go ahead and create products without these chemicals, free from these products. And this industry is sprouting up, and it is gaining momentum, and it's growing and growing and growing. And it's kind of a reflection of the American people saying, I've had it and I don't believe you. But the problem is, you can solve your problem if you have enough money to purchase these products. And that's the truth. Like, I can solve my problem. I can buy all organic food, non-toxic personal care products. And because I'm an influencer, a lot of these brands will just hand it to me for free. So this is not about me and my problem. However, anybody else that doesn't have the ability to purchase things that are more expensive, they are contaminated. They don't have a choice. And so we still need to make sure that we call these government agencies on the floor and say, what are you doing, guys? You're putting the rest of the American people into danger. And what's going on at the FDA? Pete, do you have something to say about that?
Well, I can tell a story.
Tell a story.
Laura Vandenberg and I and 10 other scientists in 2012 published a scientific paper in a journal called Endocrine Reviews, which is the biggest journal of the Endocrine Society. 800 odd references. It was a big paper. It was all about this issue we've been talking about, low dose versus high dose. And we had a meeting with the FDA to tell them what we had done before it was published, because we thought they're science, they've got scientists, they'll see the reason. So I get into a meeting with them in Washington, D.C., and I'm sitting down talking to one of the chief scientists working on bisphenol A. And she says, we don't see things like that. And I say, of course you don't. You don't test at those low levels. And she says, oh, you're right. And then 10 minutes later, I hear her saying the same thing to another scientist, one of my colleagues who was also there. Now, 6 years later, she earns at least 10 times what she used to earn at the FDA, working for a company that defends chemicals.
Whoa.
The FDA, unfortunately, while it aspires to have our trust, is a site of intense door revolving, with people moving in and out of the FDA from private industry. And her economic future depended upon her not seeing results at those levels. At least, I mean, that's what I think. I told you what I heard and what I saw and the way things are now. I'm certain that she's not the only one.
Right. So that's interesting, the revolving door. And actually, you guys are looking at someone who used to work for the government. I used to work for the California State Assembly. And when I was working for the California State Assembly, I was very, very nice to industry, because guess what? We know that you either plan on staying there forever and then you're going to run for office or do something like that, or you're going to go out into the private sector and make 4, 5, 6, up to 10 times more than you would for the government based on your connections. Now, that's what these companies are paying for. They're paying for those relationships that you made at the FDA, because that opens doors for these chemical companies so they can walk right in and get access to these people one-on-one and get to be able to convince them of whatever they want. So that revolving door is very real. I have actually benefited it from myself. And I will say that at the very young age, I believe I was about 24 years old, when I was working for a workers' compensation company as their director of communications, making way more than I ever should at 24 years old. I was making that money because of the connections that I had made when I was working for the California State Assembly. Now, that's a really interesting idea, but it's absolutely true. There is a revolving door, and it's ethically not okay, because you shouldn't be able to do that, because you then have the ability to change the way these policymakers see things because of that relationship. So they're not, it's not as if, I know people believe that, that the government is bought. And I don't really believe that the government is bought. I don't think that people are handing them over money, because that's really, 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 really bad. But there are ways to get around things. There's loopholes in the situation, like that revolving door, which pressures somebody who's working for the feds to be a little bit more open to what the industry has to say, or be a little bit more positive about what they have to say, or help them out behind the scenes, because you know that one day you want to work for them and they're going to pay you good money and you're going to be able to send your kids to the best college imaginable. This is about their lifestyle and their future. So there's a big problem. Now, I am working on something that I would love your guys' support on. And next week, I believe this is going to be next week, we are going to be launching a petition, and that is, as in me, I'm launching a petition to ask Congress to ban bisphenols. And for a lot of the reasons that we're talking about right here, but I also am asking them not only to ban bisphenols, but to force the FDA to change the way they attempt chemical safety, the way they evaluate chemicals. That has got to change. And they've got to recognize this, all the money that has been spent by the National Institutes of Health, that we've spent, our tax dollars have spent, looking at this, and the mountains of evidence showing harm. And the third thing I'm asking is to quit this revolving door. This revolving door needs to end. We're asking for a 5-year moratorium on that, so that they cannot just run to an industry and get paid 10 times what they made at the FDA or the EPA or what have you. That has got to stop. That revolving door needs to stop. So if you will support me, we're putting up this petition. We're going to do it soon. If it's not next week, it'll be the week after that, but I would appreciate all of your support. Of course, this is happening based on what is happening with independent scientists like Pete Myers, their frustration, and we're getting loud about this. We're going to talk about this. We're explaining to the consumers why this is important, how this needs to change, and we're kind of done asking the FDA to look at our side of things, because they've had their chance. They've demonstrated that they cannot be just about this. They cannot actually look at the chemicals and see harm based on all of this stuff. And the Clarity study is a perfect example of what's happening behind the scenes. Pete, do you got any final words? Because we have to go pretty soon. We've got about a minute.
You summarized it really well, Leah. It's been so frustrating to attempt to reason with the FDA over these issues. And that was even before the current administration.
Right.
It was bad for the last two administrations. It is not a function of the leader, although the current leader is going to make it even harder.
Right.
But we've got to work on different routes, different solutions. And that's what Leah is supporting here.
So I wanted to thank you guys all for joining. I saw a bunch of your questions. We couldn't get to it. This is obviously such a huge topic. So we were able to present the materials to you. I'm hoping that EcoWatch brings us back soon so that we can talk about the petition, garner more of your support. We need your support. We need your help. And we really need your help alerting Congress about this. Congress needs to know. Congress needs to force the FDA to do the right thing. They need to stop this revolving door. They need to force them to look at the real science that is from the 21st century and stop sitting in the 16th century. None of these things are good for our families. None of these things are good for us. And all of this stuff is great for industry. So I wanted to thank you all for joining EcoWatch. Thank you, Pete, so much for being part. And I hope you guys have a great day. Make sure to share this video with as many people as you can so that they understand why it is that the feds are not evaluating chemical safety the way they should be. This is an important topic, and thank you all for joining us. Have a great day.
Thank you.